Welcome to Support Life, a program focusing on current social issues from a life-affirming perspective. I'm Gavin Baulch, and later in the program we will be featuring the Street Talk interviews that we recorded last December with members of the public in the Bourke St Mall in the city. But for now, our guest is Daniel Flynn from the Australian Christian Lobby. Dan, welcome.
Thanks very much, Gavin. Pleasure to be here.
Good. We'll delve into some of your past. And when you were around about the age of 10, there was someone who kind of impressed you, and you weren't just going to make coffee at McCafe, were you?
Look, it was the great Irish barrister Frank Galbally. And at a young age I was inspired by Frank Galbally, and I said to my grandmother at the time, I'd like to be a barrister. And so that's where I headed. And that was sufficient motivation to get through high school and get into uni and eventually into law school.
Well, I was a barista because I made bad coffee, so you've gone far further than me.
Not at all.
Now, during those years, you're experiencing life, and then around about 17 years of age, what was important at that time?
17 years of age? Well, getting through VCE, I was at St Pat's College in Ballarat and was school captain at the time, so I was supposed to be leading as well as studying. And look, it was a great year, and really enjoyed those opportunities that came my way at that school. Well, school for me, I was dyslexic, and so I was a bit like a fish out of water, you might say. People didn't understand it back in those days. I'm a little older probably than yourself, but me being a fish out of water and using the word fishing, how does that apply to your life? Well, a keen fisherman and a lawyer, and I was able ultimately to combine both of those loves in working at the department that governs fisheries in Victoria. And I was fortunate enough to lead a team of prosecutors, and we prosecuted people who had undersized fish, too many fish, abalone. Abalone poaching is something that the government treats as a real high priority here in Victoria. Wow.
So are we saying that fish have rights?
You know, the truth of the matter is, Gavin, in Victoria, fish, particularly undersized fish, have more rights than unborn babies. Something I used to reflect upon working there at the department was, if someone was on a jetty and had undersized fish, those fish would be thrown back in. If they had too many fish, they'd be fined, and if it was abalone, they'd be going to jail. So I used to feel quite uncomfortable about the discordant messages in terms of our priorities as a state.
Well, that's interesting. So I was born in 1946. I would have been called an undersized fish. I was
Is that right?
More than a month prem.
Yes.
One of the first to go into humicribs.
Yes.
And I was cared for. People fought for my life.
Yes.
So I might have had a difficult time today.
That's very, very interesting. It's while you were an undersized fish, I would certainly support the work of people who, seek to protect our fishery and ensure our fishery is sustainable. But you were in a circumstance where you were undersized, and fortunately your mother wanted to have you, and that made, I'm sure made all the difference for you.
Well, certainly I wouldn't be here on this program and interviewing people, which are causing me to think. I think I learn more through the interviews than anybody watching. So, a lawyer. What was that life choice like?
Look, it was a desire to help people, I think, and on entering into the law, I became frustrated quite early and thought, look, what we're on about is splitting hairs, splitting words. Maybe I should transfer into medicine. But I never did that. I stuck with the law, but it was just a desire to help people. That's what got me in there, and I looked for a way to express that.
All right, now splitting hairs, are we talking about the meaning of words are very important?
Very much so, very much so.
So if I threw some words at you, let's take the word conscience.
Yes.
It means?
Conscience is the ability to conduct yourself in accordance with your sense of right and wrong. and that conscience can be informed by a number of things, perhaps by reason, experience, religion, but that's your inner compass. And conscience is very important in a liberal democratic society, that we have the freedom to act in conscience, and we're not dictated to as in a totalitarian regime.
All right, use the word liberal. Sometimes that's not the best word from a political point of view, but how do we apply liberal here?
Well, I think what I mean here by liberal is that we live and let live. We tolerate points of difference, and for example, in Victoria, there's a real concern about doctors being compelled to refer for abortions, which is against their conscience. Now, that is actually a broader issue than abortion strictly, because the coercion of doctors for state legislation, would spread into euthanasia and other things that perhaps the state might say, well, this is the law, and we want doctors to enforce it. And if they won't do a particular act, they must bring somebody in their place who will do it. That's a real concern that's resonating in the medical community in Victoria.
Is there a conflict here? We're talking about conscience,
yes,
and we're talking about law.
Yes.
So if I want to exercise my conscience, is law overriding that exercise?
Currently in Victoria it does. I mean, here's one example. In Section 8 of the Abortion Law Reform Act, a doctor who has a conscientious objection must refer a patient inquiring about an abortion to somebody who doesn't share that objection. Now, that's the law overriding conscience. That's an illustration of that, and it's just something we ought to watch out for in a democracy, that those who have particular skills and particular knowledge aren't being coerced by the state.
Doesn't a doctor take a Hippocratic oath?
Precisely. And the Hippocratic oath precedes Christianity, I might point out, Gavin, some 5 centuries before Christ. And the opening passage, or one of the opening passages, is I will do no harm. And currently doctors in Victoria don't take the Hippocratic oath, but they take what's called the Declaration of Geneva. And that declaration says that I will value human life and I'll practice in accordance with conscience.
That's very interesting. Well, Dan, we'll come back in a moment. You're watching Support Life, and we're going to be back after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Baulch, and our guest is Daniel Flynn from the Australian Christian Lobby. Daniel, we've had a really good chat so far, and there was a quote, and in a moment I'm going to ask you to tell me if you can remember where this came from, but let me read it. All human life is sacrosanct, and the law does not differentiate between the life of one human being and of another. However, the life of a baby is particularly special and precious. In fact, that child is utterly harmless and defenceless and helpless. And when I was born in 46, I was cared for. I was this undersized fish, and that was a very proactive belief and embracing. But recently a judge said that. What did it apply to?
That was, as you say, was Judge Justice Kay speaking in the Harley Hicks trial, and that trial just concluded recently. He was sentencing Harley Hicks for the murder of a baby during a robbery or a burglary. And look, it's a powerful statement in the context of a baby that was in its cot, in its home, and clearly a wanted baby. So it's an expression of value of a baby, which is great to hear. It'd be great to have that applied more widely.
All right, so here I am. I'm a prem child, and my life was fought to be saved.
Yes.
And here I am. I was.
Yes.
So, but are babies being aborted right up to full term?
Look, they certainly are in Victoria. It's shocking statistic. The latest we actually know is from a 2009 Victorian report that tells us that there were some 410 babies that were aborted post 20 weeks in Victoria, and that's per year. And I think in 1999 the figure was 410 babies, 200 of whom were perfectly healthy. So as healthy as the babies, or the baby that Justice Kay refers to.
Well, I certainly would have been well formed,
Yes.
and yet I lived.
Yes.
And so are the lives of the potential lives being taken unnecessarily here?
Yes, look, they certainly are, and it's very much along the lines of whether that child is wanted is the criteria. Most people, the general public, would think that late-term abortions limited to very unhealthy fetuses, mothers whose lives are threatened, and that it's a safe procedure. That's what most people are led to believe about late-term abortion. But the fact is that it is increasing, and the laws provide that it can be available for social or economic reasons, and it's clearly being accessed for those reasons.
So a young woman or mother, maybe not so young, who has an unexpected pregnancy, what's key here is that they know that they have support to go full term with their pregnancy, and then support in keeping the child later. Is that a key thing that worries women?
I think so. I think lack of support on the one hand, and perhaps coercion on the other. They're the two often external forces that can impact upon a woman. But to give that woman a surgical solution to a problem that's really, perhaps an economic or a social problem, needs a bit more thinking through.
All right. Now, I would acknowledge that science and medical science plays a role in a number of things. We've got scans now which show the 3D child
Yes.
In the womb.
Yes.
Now, does the fetus feel pain?
There's a Professor Anand who gave evidence to the US Congress in 2005. He's an Oxford PhD professor, and said, look, that the fetal science was in that children in utero do feel pain, and his recommendation that anaesthetic be administered during cardiac surgery has reduced the mortality rate from 25% to 15%. So that's had a real impact. So he's been able to detect that fetuses do feel pain, certainly as early as 20 weeks.
So this science enables a doctor to what, as far as his conscience goes?
Well, I think it probably means that a doctor ought to hesitate before performing an abortion or referring for an abortion, knowing that, look, this is not just a clump of cells, but a real human being expressing pain in much the same way that a baby outside the womb would.
Okay. Now, being a lawyer, you have to deal with law, legislation. What about pro-life legislation? How would you define that, and what's happening in that arena?
The real question is, should laws protect unborn babies? That's the ultimate question here in terms of legislation. Now, we agree that there ought to be better education and there ought to be culture change that affirms life. But one aspect of this is, what is legal, because what is legal is likely to be implemented in hospitals, and if late term is legal, it's likely to be acceptable. So legislation is important, and law reform is important in this area.
So we've covered a number of words here. We've covered conscience, we've covered pain. We're looking at legislation
Yes.
for pro-life.
Yes.
And there are examples of this?
Yes, there are. Look, there's some great heartening examples, Gavin, from overseas. Recently, Alabama passed a law, and this is earlier this year, heartbeat legislation. And that legislation requires a doctor to detect a heartbeat, and if a heartbeat is detected, an abortion cannot be performed unless the fetus is going to die in any event, or the mother is in serious health difficulties. And if a doctor performs an abortion for one of those exceptions without detecting the heartbeat, serious penalties apply. So that along with other reforms, for example, that there be a time lag between the initial consultation and the abortion, and that's 48 hours. 48 hours in Alabama at the moment, and provisions that protect a doctor's and nurse's conscience. They're all very valuable reforms.
Well, that's really good to hear. But what about our young trainee nurses and doctors? Where is the pressure in Victoria being applied to them?
The pressure is often peer pressure, Gavin. While a doctor and a nurse can generally express their conscientious objection, in a clinical dynamic situation on a ward, it's often they're often coerced by peer pressure to be involved.
I want to thank you for sharing those vital pieces of information, and look forward to speaking to you again sometime.
Thanks very much, Gavin. Appreciate that.
You're watching Support Life, and that's all for our conversation with Daniel. But stay tuned, because after the break, we'll be back with the Street Talk interviews that we recorded last December. And these were with members of the general public in the Bourke St Mall in the city.
Thank you, Mary, for coming on to Support Life, Channel 31 program. Got a couple of questions to ask you. Do you value human life?
Of course.
What do you know about the current abortion laws in Victoria?
Well, the doctor that's against it shouldn't be in trouble over it.
Have you or anyone ever been affected by the loss of a loved one?
Yeah, my mother and all my brothers and sisters.
If you heard that a pregnant woman died, for example, in a car accident, would you consider the child in her womb a second death or not?
Of course.
When does human life begin?
Oh, from the inception, I suppose.
Would it be safe to say an infant is considered a human, but what about scaling it back to a younger infant who's also developing in the womb, who at 3 to 6 months in the mother's womb? Would you consider that development a human?
Yeah, it's on its way, isn't it?
Absolutely. Would you think people are influenced by political and social pressures to abort a child?
Yeah.
In Australia, there's about 100,000 unborn children who are aborted yearly. Firstly, did you know this? And secondly, if there was another sector of our human race that was so mistreated, would you be motivated to stand up and say something for people's rights?
Of course, for people's rights, yeah.
You would?
Yeah. Somebody's got to speak up for them that can't speak for themselves.
100%, yes, agree with that. And one last question. Did you know that the current abortion laws in Victoria allow a child to be terminated right up until birth?
Well, that's wrong, isn't it? It's already started life, hasn't it? Even though it hasn't been actually born on the outside of the body, it's actually been born inside the body, so it's a life, isn't it?
Mary, thank you so much for coming on board. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Hello, we're on Support Life, a program on Channel 31, and we're here with Tamara today. Tamara, I'm just going to ask you a few questions.
Yeah.
Thanks for being on the show. Do you consider you value human life, and why?
Yeah, I think I do. I definitely think that everyone has a right to have life and have life to the fullest, and I definitely think that we should be doing, all that we can to really encourage anyone to have that opportunity.
Tell us, what do you know about the current abortion law in Victoria?
I don't really know much about what the current one is at the moment, unfortunately.
Have you or anyone you know ever been affected by the loss of a loved one? And how did that make you feel?
Yes, I think most people have. It's definitely a heartbreaking thing, and yeah, horrible.
Have you known anyone that's been affected by an abortion?
Not personally. I've done when I was at school, numerous assignments on it and read a lot into it then, but not personally.
If you heard that a pregnant woman died in a car accident, for example, would you consider the child in her womb as a second death?
Yeah, I would. I definitely think that would be considered.
And when do you think human life begins?
I definitely think human life is done from conception. As soon as it's in there, as soon as everything's starting to happen, that's a life.
So would you consider it to be a baby at 3 to 6 months in the mother's womb?
And anywhere before that even is considered. I personally would consider.
Under what circumstance would it be justifiable to terminate a child in the womb?
I think only if the baby has been seen that it's going to die as soon as it comes out. That if there are certain conditions where it is said that it's not suitable for life, and they have said it's only going to last an hour or two once it's out, I think that's acceptable. But I don't think anything else besides that really is.
So you don't think it would be okay to abort for gender selection reasons?
No.
Do you think people are influenced by political and social pressures to abort a child?
I think that there is, pressure towards different things like that, yeah.
In Australia, 100,000 unborn children are aborted yearly. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
If, let's say, another section of people, like the elderly or the disabled, were treated so poorly, would you be willing to stand up and do something about it?
Yeah, I would stand up for something like that. I definitely think that's discrimination against those things and it shouldn't be allowed.
Just one more question.
Yeah.
Did you know that it's legal to abort a child right up to birth in Victoria?
No, I did not know that at all. That's quite sad, actually.
Yeah, so an hour before the baby is due to be born.
That's quite sad, really. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on our show today. You've been great.
No problem.